Okay, thank you to everybody for joining and for tuning in. Tonight we are taking a break from our normal tefillah shiur, our normal Amidah analysis, and tonight I wanted to do a preparation for Tisha B'av, which is next week, and to prepare us for the Kinnot of Tisha B'av. Now, this is something I spoke about last year, actually, but I felt that, at least personally, a 1 hour shiur was a little bit too much, a little too long. I wanted to break it down tonight into something a little bit more digestible. So we're gonna start, as the clickbait title suggests, with a Keynote survival guide, and I want to begin by getting everybody familiar, acquainted with, and what's the word? Yeah, more familiar with the Sefer of Kinnot. So before me, I'm holding one, just a typical Kinnot book. Most people do not love this book. You shouldn't be expected to, unless you're the kind of person who reads poetry for pleasure. I can't imagine why in the world you would open one of these up and torture yourself to read it during the year. When I was young, I always used to wonder who those rabbis were who would give Shiurim Kinnais on Tisha B'av. I'm like, wait, that means they prepared before Tisha B'av. Who reads Kinnais before Tisha B'av? Who would read Kinnais throughout the year? And then fast forward 20 years later, and here I am, that guy who reads Kinnais in February. So most of it is sad religious poetry, and normally nobody really wants to open this up, to be quite honest. But if you familiarize yourself with the poetry and the history, there's a lot more interesting things here that could actually uh, give the experience of Tisha B'av a lot more meaning if we get ourselves to become a little bit more familiar with what this book is, where it came from, and why we read some of the things that are in it. Now, even when it is Tisha B'av, forget about learning and studying the Kinnais or throughout the year. Even when it is Tisha B'av, many people find trouble. To they find it hard to relate to the sorrow and to the trouble which is expressed in the pages of the Sefer HaKinnot. Today we live in a generation where the state of Israel lives in relative security with her neighbors. I'm speaking here in 2024, but Egypt and Jordan are partner countries, and Syria doesn't exist, and Lebanon is weak, and there's millions of people in Eretz Yisrael. It could be very hard to relate to the calamity and to the sorrow and grief, as if Jerusalem is in ruins, that previous generations felt like. And after the 6 Day War, there's this famous story where Shlomo Goren was leading the services for his shul. He was the chief rabbi and the chief rabbi of the Tzahal. And after the 6 Day War, there was a tremendously elated mood in Eretz Yisrael. And they started Tisha B'av like normal on our by Arvit that night. They lit the candles, they sat down to read Eicha. And halfway through Eicha, the people just started walking out. Rabbi Goren continued reading, but the congregation just started walking out. They were like, no, we can't commemorate Tisha B'av this year. We just had a miracle of miracles happen to us. The 6 Day War was such an elated, amazing miracle to rescue Klal Yisrael and to regain so much captured territory. Nobody felt like observing Tisha B'av. So if you look in the I'm sorry, I'll just pause the share for a second here. If you look in the Kinos of the Koren in the introductions, Simon Posner has this interesting shir he remembers hearing from Rav Soloveitchik, where Rav Soloveitchik was asked, Taka, and today, like, really, why are we commemorating Tisha B'av if we don't have the same level of tragedy and calamity? So he gave three answers. Number one, Tisha B'av, first of all, just like all the other Jewish holidays, is not a memory experience. It is a lived experience. Just like on Pesach, in the Seder, we make pretend ki'ilu kol davar dar chayav adam lahari says that's my ki'iluhu. The same thing with Tisha B'av. We try to experience it as if it happened to us. Number two, even during Bayis Sheni, they had to commemorate Tisha B'av because that was the destruction of Bayis Rishon. So during Bayis Sheni, they must have had some form of commemoration. And after some back and forth, he comes to the conclusion that they must have at least davened that such a thing should never happen again. And number 3, we mourn all the tragedies throughout Galus. Now, on that note, the book of Kinnot itself, by accident gives us one of the most helpful ideas to understand the Kinnot on a surface level, and that is that there's no chronological order. If you take this book that I'm holding here, or any of the Kinnot books, the Moroccan, the Ashkenaz, the Sfarad, the Italian, the Greek, whatever you're taking, it's impossible to find any one of these Sfarim which will list their poems and their dirges and their elegies and their laments in chronological order. You'll find a piyut about the Crusades before, a piyut about the Churban after, a piyut about the Holocaust. There's no rhyme or reason why one comes before the other, and that's because simply the Jewish people have never seen time as a linear process. We've learned that to put the hardships in your past, to think that hardships are a thing of the past, is a really naive thing to believe. The elegies in this book, the dirges, the laments, all the Kinnot in the Sefer HaKinnot are a reminder that the Galut was and is experienced in 1,000 different hardships and things that can happen again. We have to think about those events and what they mean for us today. Rabbinical Judaism doesn't celebrate or study history or poetry for their own sake. Only if it's history or poetry that's going to teach you things and that you're going to learn from today. Otherwise, my dahava, what happened. We can't look at these past travails, these past troubles, and see them and see ourselves as victims in a lacquer most form of history. There has to be a lens here, not who did this to us, but what did we do wrong and how could we rectify that? That has always been the attitude of the Jewish people, and that's the secret to our success. I remember Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zechreinu Livracha, he got in front of the EU once, the entire EU assembly, and he reprimanded them for not taking care of anti-Semitism in their countries. But he said anti-Semitism doesn't start with the Jewish people. It doesn't end with the Jewish people because it's not about the Jews. It doesn't start with Jews, doesn't end with Jews because it's not about the Jews. Anti-Semitism is the failure of nations to look inward at their problems. Every nation's going to reach a crisis in their history. Every nation's going to get to a crossroad where they have the option of asking, what did we do wrong, or who did this to us? And the nations that ask who did this to us are the ones who are going to lead to catastrophes, such as Nazi Germany and many other nations who asked who did this to us. Rather, what did we do wrong? The Jewish people have always been characterized, when we come to crisis, we ask ourselves, what did we do wrong? And that has been the secret to our power, not to act as victims, but to act as people who can constantly and consistently learn from our history and progress further. Now, tonight, the strategy I'm going to use is to cherry pick 10 facts about the Kinnot that I think will make this Sefer a lot more interesting to you. And I hope it'll pique your curiosity to learn more about the people, the events, and all the piyutim, and to make you Google some of those piyutim. Just install the Hebrew keyboard on your phone, install the Hebrew keyboard on your computer, and go ahead, Google these piyutim. The ones that you find the most interesting, you're going to learn a lot more from. So let's start with fact number 1. Fact number 1 is that Kinnot originally, in both Jewish history, Arab history, ancient history of all types, from all ethnicities, the dirge and the elegy and the wailing was, in many and most cultures, a genre championed by, spearheaded by, invented by, and written for women. Meaning this is the genre that was perfected by women, not men. For very famously, Yirmiyah says, and I'm trying to move my video here, right? Summon the dirge singers, let them come, send for the skilled women, meaning the women who know how to wail, and bring them and hurry them so that we can cry. Then the next pasuk he says, in the next pasuk he says, Kikol nehi nishma mitzion, for the sound of wailing is heard from Sion. And I'll skip a little. Kishimana nashim dvar Hashem, for they have heard the word of Hashem, these women, v'tikachos nechem, and lend their ears dvar piv, to hear his word, v'lamena b'dochem benotechem, and teach your daughters nehi, the art of wailing, v'isha ruta kina, and a woman should teach her friend the art of kina. And you have to understand that this was a very well paid profession and a very interesting part of cultures up until the modern times. Essentially, in many cultures throughout ancient history, the men were supposed to be the people who were seen as strong, as the rocks of the family, and it wasn't really sociologically accepted for men to cry or for men to show emotion. So for many people, having someone who could wail and recite, or not even recite, but to cry out poetically or in prose, beautiful things about the sadness and the tragedy and the person that just passed away was a great outlet for a funeral. It was a great outlet for a shiva house. And in every culture, they had a different way of doing this. In some cultures, they would do it by the graveside. Some people would do it right by the deceased. Some people would do it in the shiva house. But these women were invaluable. Many of them were geniuses, genius poets, and their downside was, sorry, they're not the downside. The failure of history to remember them is because they mostly wrote their Kinnot in their native tongues, such as Arabic and Aramaic, as the Gemara says, "Sursi li'ilaya," right? So, Syriac is for the dirge singing. In other words, when we write tefillos, we write them in one language, but if we're going to say a kinah, we're going to do it in the mother tongue, in Aramaic, because so many of these brilliant women who were skilled at stirring people to show their emotions and to getting them to cry, or at least creating one moment where people could cry, that artwork, that profession has really gone away. If you look in the Mishnah Ksubais, Rabbi Yehuda says, "Afilu ani shebi Yisrael yifchos mishnei chalilim umekanenas." In their times, even the poorest person doesn't have any, should not deserve less than having two flute players by their funeral, and one mikonenet, and one professional wailer. This was especially older women, this was a great way for them to make a little bit of extra cash. And this culture survived up until really the 1950s, 1960s. A lot of the immigrants from Morocco, from Yemen, still followed this minhag to have a woman or a few women who would have this profession of wailing and of reciting Kinnot by a shiva or by a levaya. It's really a shame that we've lost this art form, and that so much of this genre, which we owe to women, is lost to the men who wrote scholarly versions of Kinnot, because originally the men were only in charge of hespedim. It was the women who were in charge of the Kinnot, and most of the genre, most of the poetic power, most of the poetic style was invented by women, not by men. This is attested to in multiple places, multiple brises, multiple psukim. You don't need to take my word for it. And if there's a lesson here, well, perhaps the lesson is that if you're a Jewish woman and you want to express yourself and you want to be heard and you want to be remembered, think about writing in Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, the works that were written in Hebrew, unlike Yiddish, unlike Arabic, unlike Ladino, last forever. And the power of those words has much more staying power if you write in Hebrew. Okay, but now moving on. Eventually, the Kinnah was appropriated by men when it came to the liturgical sense, and it was the rabbis and the erudite who would write Kinnot professionally for special occasions, and they would base these on midrashim, and they would make them very scholarly. That leads us to fact number 2. Fact number 2 is that Kinnot were not always a part of Tisha B'Av. You have to realize that in the yeshivot in Bavel, they never said Kinnot. And the yeshivot in Bavel, just like all the other fasts, instead of putting in Kinnot into the tefillah, in the brach of Salach Lanu, they would add Selichot. It was called Selichot because the Chazara of Shmona Esrei, they would add extra piyutim, extra poems into the brach of Salach Lanu called Selichot. And for a long time, the yeshivot of Bavel had this minhag. They would recite Selichot, not Kinnot. It was only the yeshivot in Eretz Yisrael that would recite Kinnot. While in Bavel, it was Eicha. They would recite Eicha, and they would do Selichot in the Salach Lanu. It wasn't until a few hundred years later, when a lot of the influence from the yeshivot of Eretz Yisrael made its way to Bavel, that the minhag began to change. And once we get to early Spain, we find that they began switching from saying slichot on Tisha B'Av to saying Kinnot. There's a lesson here for us, and that is that what they were realizing was that Tisha B'Av was not about sin. Tisha B'Av was not about teshuvah. Tisha B'Av was about grief. Tisha B'Av was about sorrow and about feeling the sadness of the Churban. And they began to realize that unlike the other fasts, it was much more appropriate to practice Tisha B'Av with an emphasis on grief. Now, if you want to get nuanced here, many Kinnot and Slichot look very similar. They could talk about the same topics. They could talk about the Churban. They could talk about our sins. They could talk about how Hashem destroyed us. And they could even ask for forgiveness. The difference fundamentally between a Kinnah and a Slicha is who takes the blame. Essentially, in a Slicha, we approach Hashem with our fault. We say, we did this, it's our fault, we sinned, and you're looking for restitution, absolution, whatever you want to call it. You're looking to get atonement. While in a Kinnah, that's not necessarily the case. In a Kinnah, the emphasis is grief, and we feel in a Kinnah the audacity to challenge Hashem. We feel the impetus to ask why, and not necessarily blame ourselves. But through that grief, we even feel licensed to challenge Hashem, which is not something to be taken for granted. This is something which is given permission for in a few sugyot. But that is the fundamental nuance difference between a Kinnah and a Slicha. In one, you're looking for atonement and you're accepting the blame, and in the other, you are looking to find sorrow and you're begging Hashem for answers why. Okay. Fact number 3. Fact number 3 about the Kinnot is that the main character of the Kinnot, at least if you're Ashkenaz, the main character is almost always Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir. Here you could see a street sign in Eretz Yisrael, which is named after him. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir, this is the most interesting part of the fact. He was not a Tana. As you can see, even the street sign gets it right. He lived in the 7th century in Eretz Yisrael. We have scholars today consider the Kinnah the pinnacle of his artistic achievement because of all of the different piyutim he wrote, and he wrote hundreds, if not thousands. We have the most in the Kinnah genre from him than any other genre that we have from him. And the fact that we know that he lived in the 600s, and the fact that we know that he lived in Eretz Yisrael shows us that to the people that lived in Eretz Yisrael in that time, the loss of the Beit HaMikdash and the Churban was still very intimately felt. For them, living in Eretz Yisrael and not having the Beit HaMikdash and being ruled by the Persians or the Arabs was still a very big cause for grief. And they felt it very intimately. On a side note, one of the reasons we know that he lived in the 600s, in case you're going to bring me rayas from different Rishonim, the Rishonim were misinformed, unfortunately. We have poems from Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir where he describes the Arab conquest of Eretz Yisrael in 635. And not just that conquest. He gets more specific. He sort of speaks about how the Arabs conquered it, and then the Persians took it back for 14 years, and then the Arabs conquered it again. So he clearly was alive in the early 600s, and we know that Rabbi Eliezer clearly lived in the 600s. If anybody wants to email me or call me after this year, I could explain to you what Rabbeinu Tam got wrong, how the Rishonim were misinformed about this. And it's actually Machlekes Rishonim, so I'll explain it to anybody gladly after this year if they want to, if they want to know more. Now, this will lead us to fact number 4. Because, okay, if you're Ashkenaz and you heard of Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir, he takes up 20, 30 piyutim of the Sefer HaKinnot. Well, fact number 4, and this is the most relieving one, is that Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir never meant to torture you. I promise. He never wrote 20 or 30 Kinnot for you to sit down after Shmona Esrei and to sit down on the floor after Shmona Esrei and after Eicha and read all of these Kinnot. That's not what he designed them for, and that's not what kind of artist he was. You see, there's a type of poetry, a type of piyut called a krova. A krova is where you take a chazarat hashatz, you take a Shmona Esrei, and you take the chazara portion of it, and you replace every bracha in the chazarat hashatz with a poetic version of that bracha. In the case of Tisha B'Av, this is called a krovat yudchet. This is called a krova of Shmona Esrei. Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir wrote at least 5 different versions of a krova for Tisha B'Av. Wrap your brain around that. That means that he wrote 5 different 18 blessing poetic portfolios. So either he did that for 5 different years or he did it for 5 different congregations. Whatever he did, we have at least 5 different versions of a krova for Shmona Esrei from Kalir. So essentially, what was supposed to happen in Shul was that everyone would pray Shmona Esrei in Eretz Yisrael, and then by Chazarat Hashatz, the Chazan would get up, and the Chazan alone would recite this poetic, what's it called, version of Shmona Esrei, where there would be a piyut or poetic version of each bracha, and then in the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim, there would be a whole extra portfolio of piyutim to embellish the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim. Now, the part of the relic of this ancient practice was that in the Western European Kinnot, many of them retained this practice, and I wish I brought it with me, but I was lucky enough to buy in the Mizrahi bookstore a Rodelheim Kinnot, a lot from Germany. Rodelheim was like the art scroll in Germany, and they back in Germany in the real Nusach Ashkenaz Kinnot, the minhag was that only the Chazan recites the Kinnot from Kalir. Essentially, this is a relic from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, when the Ashkenazim would still do the krova properly, and they would still do the Kinnot inside the Shmona Esrei. Because after a lot of time, the krovot were no longer said the way they were done appropriately, and they no longer said the Kinnot inside the Chazarat Hashatz. Therefore, they moved it to after Chazarat Hashatz, and still it was only for the Chazan to say, because he did the Chazarah. So for that reason, it was only the Chazan that recited the ones from Kalir, and then after the Kalirian ones, everyone would recite the rest. So it's actually marked off in those machzorim that there's a distinction there. If you're lucky enough to have a Greek or an Italian machzor Roma, machzor Romaniot, if you're lucky enough to have one of those sidurim, you'll see that they still have the krovot properly. They still do it correctly, and some of the old school Yekisha people will still do a krova the way it was supposed to be done. But essentially, fact number 4 was that Rabbi Eliezer Kalir had a much more artistic setting in mind, and a much more poetic setting in mind. He didn't intend for everybody to sit down and read 20 or 30 Kinnot, absolutely divorced from any exciting context. He wrote maybe 5 Kinnot for Bnei Yerushalayim, 5 piyutim for Bnei Yerushalayim in each kreva. It wasn't a matter of writing 30 that you should sit down and say all 30. We just historically have retained so many that they ended up in these books. Okay, fact number 5 is that Rabbi Eliezer Kalir is not the earliest Paitan that we know of. He's not the earliest writer of Kinnot that we know of. We have Kinnot that are so old that they're written in Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, which essentially means the Syriac, not Syriac, but Syriac-like Aramaic that was spoken in Eretz Yisrael in the 300s, 400s, 500s. These are Kinnot that go really way back. We also have Kinnot that are written in forms that are much more simple than the poetic forms from Kalir. For example, Azbachateinu Charav Mikdash is one of the best known ones. That's a much more simple, from an artistic perspective, the poetry is a lot more simple, and it most definitely predates Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Kalir. So we do have piyutim from even earlier than him. He wasn't the inventor of the genre. He definitely was standing on the shoulders of other people. And it's worth knowing and understanding that the Kinnah genre goes back to the very ancient times. Those Aramaic piyutim that I just showed you are in pristine Jewish Palestinian Aramaic, which means that they could be as early as the 300s or 400s. Very, very early Kinnot. This is an art form which is native to the Jewish people, which we've been perfecting for 2,000 years. Okay, fact number 6. Fact number 6 is that making mincha about nechama instead of about avelos is a minhag that goes back at least 1,000 years. There's many different minhagim regarding, let's say, for example, the tefillah of Nachem, or the minhag to get up and stand off the floor by mincha time. Essentially, some kilot will only say Nachem by mincha. Some kilot will say Rachem Hashem Elokeinu instead of Nachem Hashem Elokeinu by Arvita and Shachrit. And they'll only say Nachem by mincha. What was discovered recently in the Geniza was that this idea of making mincha about nechama goes back to the earliest krovot. The krovot that were written for the mincha Shmona Esrei of Tisha B'Av, those krovot Yudchet were about nechama. And this is a little bit tangential, but the bracha of Nachem I want to discuss it more when we get up to the bracha of Bonei Yerushalayim, because it's very much intertwined. But the bracha of Nachem is very controversial up until this day. There's a lot of traditional Israelis who don't like the bracha of Nachem, because the classical one says that the classical Nachem, the standard nusach, says that the Yerushalayim is, desolate and barren and destroyed. Well, that's not the case with Yerushalayim anymore. So Shlomo Goren was clever enough that in 1967 he borrowed some of the older versions of Nachem from the Yerushalmi and from other nuschot, and he devised a newer version, not really a new, but a restored version of Nachem from the older nuschaot for all the people who didn't like saying Nachem is Manazeh with the old nusach. But regardless, fact number 6 is that making mincha about nechama goes back at least 1,000 years. Number 7 is that if you open a Kinnot's Sefer HaKinnot, you will find a section where many of the piyutim begin with the word Sion. These are called Sionim, or piyutim which start with the word Sion. All of these piyutim are imitations and lesser than imitations of a kinah called Sion Halot Tishali. Sion Halot Tishali, and I don't know if I could show it to you right here. Sion Halot Tishali is a poem written by one of the greatest poets that ever lived, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And I say not one of the greatest poets, but not one of the greatest Jewish poets, one of the greatest poets that ever lived. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wrote Sion Halot Tishali, and it took the world by storm. It was such a magnificent piece of art and such a magnificent piece of religious literature that it moved the hearts of the Jewish people far and wide. It took months for this poem to reach every corner. It was like a smash hit, so to speak. It took months for it to hit every corner of the globe, and it affected the psychology of Jewish people up until this day. People who felt very strongly about Sion, about the return to Eretz Yisrael. A lot of the people who are very Zionistic find a lot of emotion and passion in this beautiful piyut. Now, a lot of the imitations have no business of being inside the Sefer HaKinnot. I'm sorry. A lot of them are just lesser than. Even Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gabirol wrote an imitation of this, not an imitation. He wrote something similar. But Sion Halot Tishali is by far the best one. And you'll find is that some of the Kinnot Sfarim have the audacity of publishing Sion piyutim from other people before they published the Sion Halot Tishali from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Like, they'll publish the imitations before they'll publish the original. One of the most interesting parts about this Sion genre is that the reason Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was able to impart such a beautiful passion and longing for Eretz Yisrael is because it's based on one of his earlier very impassioned poems. The entire poem essentially treats Tzion, Yerushalayim, as if it is a female figure who is an entity which Yehuda Halevi misses. His heart wishes he was in Tzion, and he constantly refers to it by her, or by you in the feminine sense. He has an earlier poem that he wrote. I think it's a Tzivia Malecha. What's it called again? Tzvilia. It's called a Tzviya poem, which he wrote. Clearly, he wrote this poem for someone that he loved, a woman that he loved. We don't know who it was. But earlier in his life, he wrote a poem, a love poem, which is essentially the model for this poem. It's probably one of the greatest non-religious poems he ever wrote also. And he modeled Sion Halot Tishali over that earlier love poem. And that's a reason why you see such great passion in it and such a real emotion, is because he takes all the lessons he learned and all the muscles that he developed writing real artistic poetry, and he used them for Kodesh. And if you want to get nuanced, in his time, he probably wouldn't have considered Sion Halot Tishali a Kodesh piyut. He probably would have considered it secular. I don't think he would have considered it a kinah. He probably would have just considered it like a piece of propaganda, so to speak. He probably would have, not even propaganda, but almost like a message for his cause, that he believed that it was appropriate for Jews to return to Eretz Yisrael. I don't think he would have considered it a holy piyut when he wrote it, but history took it another direction. Okay, fact number 8 is that there are Kinnot that were written for Tisha B'Av, and there are Kinnot that were written for other tragedies that aren't in the book. This Ashkenaz version, the Sephardi version, the Greek version, the Italian, the Hasidic version, no matter which one you open up, there are ones that are not in your book. You can open up, let's say, for example, I have a picture here of the Moroccan Kinnot book. If you're Syrian, I advise you to open a Moroccan version. If you're Moroccan, I advise you to open up a Syrian version. There are Kinnot that are not in your book. There are Kinnot that never got into any of the Sefer HaKinnot, because you'll have to go to Hebrew books and say Piyutei Rashi, Piyutei Rav Shimon Bar Yitzchak, Piyutei Rabbi Yanai. You'll have to go searching the internet for Piyutei or searching the bookstores for Eliya Bar Shemaya or Yosef ibn Abitur, any of the great Paitanim throughout history. Most of them wrote Kinnot, and there are very beautiful Kinnot that were written throughout history that never made it to the book. If you are interested in some of this poetry, in some of this work, either if it's for historical purposes or for religious purposes, you have to broaden your horizons, because you're not going to find all of them in the Kinas Sfarim. That leads me to fact number 9, which is that there is no nusach of the Kinnot book. Meaning, it's the one printers can fool you. A printer is going to show you this is nusach Ashkenaz, nusach Sephardi, nusach Morocco, nusach Syria. There's no such thing as a nusach. There's a minhag Morocco, minhag Suri, there's minhag Aram Soba, minhag Ashkenaz. Essentially, you could sort of call it a minhag, but over the past 1,000 years, every locale, and I don't mean every country, I mean every locale had their own favorite Kinnot that they would say. Every city, every town had their own ones. They would simply recite the ones that was most dear to them. And over time, different locales developed their own portfolios, their own ones that they decided to put into their machzorim. And once the printing press was invented, the printers decided to include the ones that they felt were most popular and would sell. It's just accidents of history that make the machzorim of the sidurim of Kinnot that you have, the ones that you have today. For example, there are some natural progressions that you will expect. For example, in the Ashkenaz versions, you'll have a lot more Kalirian stuff, because the Ashkenazim usually kept the Putim of Kalir. In the Sephardi versions, you'll have a lot more Yudah Levi and Gabi Roll and Abitur and a lot of the great Sephardi Paitanim. But there's also crossover. The Ashkenaz Kinnot book will have Sephardim, and the Sephardi will have Ashkenazi, and there's a lot of crossover. There is no official nusach of the Kinnot. There is no official book. There is no official canon. It is just a matter of minhag. And that leads me to fact number 10. And this is probably the biggest relief that anyone will hear. That is, you do not have to read every Kinnah. You do not. I checked the Shulchan Aruch. I checked the Torah. I promise you don't have to read every Kinnah. If you don't like it, if the poetry is no good, if it's meh, if you want to skip, read a different one. Read one that you like. I wanted to end with a couple of tips just to get to actually give people this Kinnot survival guide, just to help you out if you live in a community or in a culture where the Kinnot is the entire Tisha B'Av and you have nothing else to do. Then first of all, I'm so sorry, but second of all, there are ways to get through this very long book and not completely go crazy. I know that the Moroccan Minyan, for example, they have this minhag that they'll first do Shachrit, and then they'll do Kinnot all the way up until Chatzot, and then they'll do Kriyat Torah, and then they'll do Aleinu and let everybody go. That's kind of a hard davening to be a part of. If you're stuck in shul for 2.5, 3 hours reciting Kinnot and you don't understand any of them, you're not going to have a good time. Let's start with the first tip. Don't read too many. Pick a few that you like, pick a few that you could easily understand, and focus on those. Try to learn them, try to recite them, and gradually, year over year, you're going to build up a familiarity with more and more Kinnot. That's number 1. Number 2, read those ones out loud. Poetry is written and meant to be spoken. You're not going to fully appreciate a poem unless you can speak it out loud with your breath and your mouth and hear the words come out of your mouth, because you have to hear how the words sound, how the words feel, how the stanzas land. Number 3, I would say to buy a good translation, a good commentary, buy a good Kinnah book. Some of the Ashkenaz Kol Yaakov ones, like I'll show you a picture over here, like this pamphlet one, they're terrible, because frankly, they don't put any of the Kinnot in stanzas like proper poetry. They don't actually put the sticks, the hemisticks, they don't structure them properly. It's a disaster. You don't understand the Kinnah as a piece of poetry. You're not going to know how to read it. You're not going to know the cadence. You're not going to know the rhythm. You're not going to see the rhyme. Buy a good translation. Buy a good Sefer HaKinnot. I could recommend the Mossad Harav Kook has the Seder HaKinnot Tisha B'Av. I could recommend the Koren has done it very beautifully. They've done a great translation. They have a very good commentary. I'd recommend buying one that you like, buying a translation and a commentary that you're going to like and is going to appeal to you. Many used Kinnot books are cheap. You don't have to spend a fortune. You can buy, at the very least, buy one you like. I'm personally not a fan of the Art Scroll. I don't think they're as skilled as the other publishers. But if it's something that you like and it works for you, get one of those. Number 4, do something else if you're out of energy. Don't waste a good Kinnah on your lip service. If you're just going to be sitting there reading, everybody agrees that quality is better than quantity here. Everybody agrees that when you're reciting Kinnot, the quality is more important than the quantity of Kinnot you're going to do. Find something else to do on Tisha B'Av, which is meaningful to you, or go to sleep rather than reciting Kinnot that you have no idea what they mean. You'd much rather be doing something else, learning from listening to a shiur, doing something. Kinnot are not lip service. They are piyutim that were written to move you. And if you have no idea what you're reading, this is not Shmona Esrei. You're not going to get some magical, mystical, Kabbalistic power, which is going to improve your life because you read that Kinnah. It has to move you. And I would only recommend reading the Kinnot if they appeal to you. And if you feel like the entire book doesn't mean anything to me, think twice. Open it, find something that you understand. And if you don't like the Ashkenaz one, take out a Sephardi one. If you don't like the Sephardi one, take out an Ashkenaz one. Find something that you can relate to. At least spend 20 minutes looking through somebody else's Kinnah Sefer until you find something that piques your interest, until you find in the Koran some history that piques your interest. And lastly, tip number 5, buy a book that's not a Kinnah book. You can buy, for example, the Jews in the Crusades. You could buy you could download Gzerot Ashkenaz V'Tzarfat. There's a lot of interesting histories of Tisha B'Av. There's a lot of interesting histories of the Jewish people that can give you perspective into the history of Tisha B'Av and of national tragedy that the Kinnah book will not. And if you find something in the Kinnah Sefer, let's say it's a little history, a little story over there, go to the sources, Google it, search it. Maybe not in shul. I don't know how many rabbis are going to love it if you pull out your phone in the middle of the Kinnot. I know over here in this shul, the rabbi will not like it. But maybe when you get home, make a note that you want to look up Kinnah number 45. Look it up. Look up the history. And it's better than scrolling through Instagram on Tisha B'Av because you have nothing to do. Take some notes during the Kinnot. Take some notes for for what piques your interest. Take some notes for that history. Take some notes for those Kinnot. I promise you, there's a plethora of resources online. The National Library of Israel has an entire section on piyutim. The Hebrew Wikipedia has many articles on piyutim. And if it comes to Jewish history, there's plenty to study. So don't feel estranged by the Sefer HaKinnot. Don't feel like this is something that's here to torment you. This is a supplement. This is something which is meant to make your Tisha B'Av more meaningful. And using this as a companion rather than as a siddur that you have to get through is going to make your Tisha B'Av a lot more meaningful. So thank you to everybody for your time, for your attention. I hope everybody has very meaningful Tisha B'Av. And we will continue hopefully next week.